Hi everybody, this is the lecture to accompany Chapter 8 in your textbook. Please read Chapter 8, there's lots of information I don't have time to address in the lecture. Okay, let's talk about group problem-solving procedures. Missouri State University is the location for this chapter's case study. Their music department needed to temporarily relocate while their building was being remodeled. The Campus Space Committee initially looked into finding available space on campus because they were told that space must be found there. But the more they researched the problem, the more they realized that there was simply no place to put the department faculty, staff, and the necessary music rooms, pianos, and instruments. The committee reported to their bosses that they couldn't find the necessary space if they were constrained by not being able to lease off-campus space. So they were given permission to look at other options, which they did, and eventually found a nearby strip mall with a large vacant space that would suit their needs. This problem took months to solve, but it is definitely the kind of thing that work groups face. The chapter will outline the steps used by groups to solve complex problems like this one. If you remember back in Chapter 1, we discussed the advantages and disadvantages of using groups to solve problems. For complex problems, a group can often come to a better solution than any one individual can, even if that individual has a great deal of knowledge about the topic. For groups, the whole is often greater than the sum of its parts. This is what is known as the assembly effect. This is achieved when the group's solution is superior both to the choice of the group's most expert member and to an averaging of the opinions of all members. This happens when groups work interdependently, discussing all aspects of the problem and potential solutions. Groups have more resources and more access to those resources, and members who work well together can understand and accept solutions more readily and completely. Of course, group work isn't perfect. Some of the disadvantages are that group work does take more time, and depending on the makeup of the group, participation may not be equal among the members. Also, interpersonal tension can sometimes get in the way. Although we will be discussing a specific problem-solving process in this chapter, there are obviously many different ways to solve problems. Consulting an expert, figuring it out for yourself. Those ways are good for problems that affect only you, but for problems that affect the larger population, they may not be the best. Using a careful, systematic process is both effective and ethical, especially if the lives and livelihoods of people hang in the balance. The first thing you need to understand is what a problem is, and how to determine exactly what it is you're seeking to change, what you want the outcome to be. The text defines a problem as the difference between what currently exists and what you want to exist. Everything that can be classified as a problem has three components: an existing situation that is seen as undesirable, a potential desired situation, the way you want things to be, and the obstacles that are standing in the way of changing the undesirable situation into the desired situation. Something you also need to understand is your group's area of freedom as it relates to the problem. The area of freedom is the amount of authority and limitations that the group has to work with when solving the problem. If a work group to which you're assigned is simply a fact-finding one that may come up with potential solutions but has no power to choose a solution, then trying to do that as part of your group effort isn't going to work, because that wasn't the group's task. It's critical to know your authority and responsibility as it pertains to the problem. In your problem-solving panel discussion, you should assume that you've been given the authority to determine the best solution for a problem and to define a plan to implement it. In real life, of course, you don't have any authority over that, but this is a learning situation, so we're just going to pretend that you do. Your group is also going to have to ask some questions about the particular nature of your problem, because certainly not all problems are alike. You do this so you can understand the problem more completely, and you can begin to shape your overall problem-solving procedures to fit the details of your problem. Problems can be classified by these 5 characteristics. Task difficulty. How complex is this problem? Is it so complex that there may be no clear solution? Or is it fairly simple and straightforward? For your topic, it's probably going to be somewhere in between. Solution multiplicity. Are there many potential solutions? Or is there probably only one correct answer? For your topic, there may be many good solutions, but you might have to determine that one or maybe two have the best chance of solving the problem. Intrinsic interest is the level of interest that the group members have in solving the problem. In our class, you should try to select topics that the members care about, as it's going to make them more excited and willing to tackle the topic. Member familiarity. How much do the members know about this or similar topics? Can some members provide background information or personal experiences that can add to the discussion? Or is everybody working from square one? Acceptance level. This has to do with the solution you come up with. Is it critical that it be accepted by whoever's in charge, or the people who it will affect, or are you just making recommendations, or is the solution not that big a deal? These are very important things to know about the problem, and your group needs to discuss them and come to a deeper understanding of what the group's task is about this topic. Once you have a clear understanding of the problem and your group's goal regarding it, then you can come up with your discussion question. Now, this is like a central idea or thesis statement, but it's phrased in question form. It must be a clear statement of the problem and can't be vague or leading to a particular solution. So here are some guidelines to help you phrase your questions well. First, don't write it as an either-or question. The only time that might be appropriate is if your group has already determined that there are only two possible solutions to the problem. Setting it up as an either-or leaves out all the other possible solutions. Word questions as concisely as possible. Make sure you're not actually asking two questions instead of one. The question should encompass the scope of the problem, making it very clear what the problem is. Finally, don't suggest a solution in the question. Don't say, should we do this thing to fix that thing? It's better to say, what can we do to solve the problem of, and then describe the problem. It's important to really discuss the nature of the problem thoroughly in your group before you begin to look at solutions. While there are many systematic processes for solving problems in groups, the one we're going to be using in this class is called the PMOPS, which stands for Procedural Model of Problem Solving. It's a structured yet flexible framework that will help guide your group through each of the 5 phases of the problem-solving process. These 5 steps are describing and analyzing the problem, generating possible solutions to the problem, evaluating those solutions, choosing the best solution, and implementing the chosen solution. So let's now look at each of these 5 steps. In step 1, describing and analyzing the problem, all the things we've talked about in terms of understanding exactly what the problem is come into play here. So as a group, you figure out what your problem consists of and what your job, task, or assignment, also known as the charge, is. You need to come up with a discussion question and make sure at this point your group is focused on the problem, its scope, who it affects, how complicated it is, etc. You need to be able to thoroughly describe and explain it. At this point, you'll need to determine your group meeting schedule and decide who's going to be doing what. Before you're done with this step, you'll need to summarize the problem and make sure everyone's on the same page. It might be good to spend one meeting just on this step. You want to have time to process the problem before you move on to step 2, where now you're ready to start generating possible solutions. These solutions might be completely off the top of your head during brainstorming, or maybe something you've heard or thought about before, or maybe something you found during your research about the problem, or something you come up with when someone else puts a solution out there and it causes you to think of something else. It's a very creative process at this point. Don't forget that someone should be listing all the solutions people come up with, and at this point there should be absolutely no criticism of any potential solution, no matter what you personally think of it. However, you can certainly ask someone to explain or clarify a solution they propose so that you understand it better. But at no point during this step does anyone give their opinion of whether they think a solution will work or not. Once your group has determined that they have exhausted all the possibilities, then you can proceed to step 3. Now, your group needs to look at all the solutions and evaluate them according to a set of criteria you're going to establish. These are standards and guidelines that you're going to use to determine the viability of each solution. Sometimes criteria are absolute. For instance, if you're a member of a search committee looking for a new tenure-track professor at a college, the finalists you select have to have at least a master's degree. But some of your criteria can be more flexible. Maybe you'd like the tenure candidate to have some experience teaching a particular class, or a certain number of years of teaching, but you're also willing to consider people without that experience. So you need to decide as a group if some criteria must be met while others can be flexible. Some obvious criteria are listed here. Will the proposed solution solve the problem? Can the proposed solution actually be done? Will the benefits outweigh the costs? And how acceptable will the solution be to those most affected by it? But your group might come up with others as well. Once you have criteria, then you can start applying them to each of the solutions. Some are going to pass, others will fail. Narrow down your list to what you can agree is the top 2 or 3. Then start thinking about the pros and cons of each of those solutions that are left. Trust me, there are pros and cons to every solution. Write them down. During this step, there may be some secondary tension, as some members might see certain solutions as much better than others, while other members disagree. Remember that conflict is natural, but that hearing each other out and attempting to understand others' viewpoints is necessary in order to come to a consensus. Keep the arguments constructive and personal defensiveness to a minimum. There are lots of ways in which a group can come to a decision. Sometimes the final decision comes from the group leader, sometimes from a group expert, sometimes from flipping a coin, and much of the time from voting, as in majority rules. What you are trying to do in most cases is to reach a consensus, which is a decision all members agree is the best they can all support, but may not be everyone's first choice. Consensus decision-making, if it's done well and ethically, tends to build community and support for the final decision. Once your group has tentatively adopted a decision, it's a good idea to look at it with an eye to any potential problems or risks of implementing the solution. Look at the cons on the pros and cons worksheet you did after you narrowed down the solutions in the last step. Do the benefits of implementing the solution outweigh the cons? There are always problems, but can they be minimized or even eliminated by careful planning? These are things your group needs to understand and acknowledge. Once you've decided that your solution passes the test, you have one final thing to do. The final step in problem solving is implementing the solution, or in the case of your panel, explaining to the audience how the solution can and should be implemented. Sometimes a group is charged with putting a plan into action. Sometimes they're simply responsible for reporting on the solution, and then some other entity puts the plan into action. Your job here is to explain how the solution can be implemented, who'd be responsible for it, how it would work, how much it would cost, and how it would be paid for, things like that. PERT, an acronym for Program Evaluation and Review Technique, is a method of implementing solutions. Now, you don't necessarily have to use it for the implementation step to show us how the solution could be successful, but what I found is that it's a really good tool for organizing the work your group needs to do to create the presentation you'll be giving. Sample 8.3 in the textbook is a good example of using PERT to keep track of who's doing what and when it should be done, so your group will be ready for the presentation. It keeps everyone on track and lets them know their specific responsibilities. Problem solving and decision making are related, but they're not the same thing. Problem solving includes all the actions you have to take to get from the existing situation to the goal. That includes defining the problem, coming up with possible solutions, and then choosing the best solution. Decision-making is a specific part of that process. It's the act of selecting from all the available options. Something called the functional theory states that it is communication that either helps or hinders the group's ability to be effective problem solvers and decision makers. Whether a group solves problems effectively depends on these 3 factors. Task requirements refer to the 5 steps of the problem-solving process. Group problem solving is a systematic rather than a haphazard process, so it's critical that you stick to the 5 steps. Efficacy of communication refers to how well group members use their communication skills to do things like share information, discuss, ask questions, to overcome obstacles and reach the goal. Willingness to review refers to the degree of willingness your group members have to review your process and information, being fair, looking critically at everything, and possibly even reconsidering the decision to make sure your group is on the right track. There's an example of the PMOPs outline in Table 8.6 and also one in the problem-solving panel discussion assignment description. Yours should be at least somewhat similar. But because different problems and issues have different components, it's not going to be exactly the same. And because you may have 4, 5, or 6 people in your group, the way it's presented might be somewhat different than what other groups do. But, generally speaking, the presentation will go something like this. The moderator is going to control the flow of the information and discussion. Now, the panel should last between 25 and 30 minutes, and the time will be distributed generally this way. First, the moderator gives a general introduction to the panel topic and introduces the first speaker. Then the first speaker describes and analyzes the problem. The moderator then introduces the next speaker. The next speaker talks about and explains the possible solutions the group came up with. Then the moderator introduces the third speaker, who evaluates the pros and cons of the possible solutions. Then the moderator introduces the fourth speaker. That person talks in depth about the best solution. And then, finally, the moderator introduces the final speaker, who talks about the best way to implement the solution. And then the moderator gives a concluding statement. Now, this is a panel from a group of 6 people. If you have 4 or 5 or maybe even 7 people, you'll have to adjust it so that all sections of the PMOPs are adequately addressed. It could be that the moderator needs to both introduce the topic and do the job of the first speaker as well, but your group will be the one to decide that. This chapter is giving you some good information about problem-solving procedures, particularly as they relate to your problem-solving panel discussion assignment. But, as you can see, they will serve you well in any other groups you find yourself involved in, at work, at church, and in your community. This is the end of the lecture on Chapter 8.